describe the moment when you arrived in Sydney after such a long flight.
It was also a very incident. I mean, to be fair, I was tired, very, very tired, and I was really glad I didn't have to get into that thing the following morning and fly it. You were very circumscribed inside it. You couldn't really move. I mean, the exercises consisted of doing something like this and lifting your feet 3 inches off the pedals and then getting them back down again. So I was met there by the head of Dalgety from London, who had come out there specifically to meet me, and you know, lots of things had happened. I'd been wrecked on a Greek island and glued it back together again. I'd had at least 3 engine failures in the Saudi desert and come down on the desert itself. And I fell in the Persian Gulf on Christmas Day in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War, which was not really very healthy, 32 miles out to sea. But I got rescued by a helicopter with 2 Canadian pilots, found my mechanic, who had Mike Atkinson, who had a ticket to Australia, and he was carrying a spare engine as hand baggage. It was that small, the engine. And we went back 6 hours later and found the aircraft still floating, and pulled it out of the water and got it to fly again in 5 days, and flew on. And you know, the incident about going mad over India, you know, that lasted for 3 days. I had 3 outlandings in Malaysia. I landed on a paddy field, in a track in a paddy field. I landed on a plantation, and I landed to ask the way because I was following a helicopter pilot who was so bad-mannered he just disappeared into the distance, didn't keep an eye on me at all. So I had to land and say to the local man who was selling vegetables, "Do you know where there's a helicopter airport?" And he said, "If you take this road, 15 miles down the road, mountain on your right-hand side, past that, come to a T-junction, turn left, over the railway lines on your right." And he drew this on the back of an envelope, and I leapt back into the car again, pushed everybody out of the way and took off and finally got there. So a lot of adventures. I mean, when I got to Tennant Creek in the Northern Territories, they'd had the strongest earthquakes in Australia for 100 years, and I landed just in time for the 3rd of the earthquakes that day. And I remember seeing the mayor the following morning. All of us were, you know, slept all night with the rumbling going on and things shifting. And he said, nothing happens in Tennant Creek for year after year. And he said, then in one day we get 3 earthquakes and you turn up. And I remember saying to him, you know, but it wasn't really my fault. Well, I got out of there quickly. So getting to Sydney was great. It was, you know, and the Australians really welcomed it. It was very badly treated in England. My fellow Microlight pilots, the official magazine called it the world's longest ego trip, and a year after I'd completed the flight and 9 months after I got back to England, not one club in England had asked me to speak about it. But at the time it was the longest, fastest Microlight flight in the world, and it lasted, that record lasted for 9 years until a man called Colin Baddill, another Englishman, came along, and I took 59 days to get to Sydney and he took 49 days.
Wow. Who inspires you?
I have heroes. I believe that we have to have heroes. So when I was standing in the Persian Gulf looking at my aircraft after having fallen in the sea, and I was looking at it and I think nothing's broken. Okay, it's wet but there's no damage to the thing. And I knew a man called Francis Chichester, a New Zealander, later Sir Francis Chichester, had his aircraft had almost sunk on a flight between New Zealand and Australia. He'd landed at Norfolk Island, and it had sank when he came in the following morning, and there it was half in the water. And he pulled it out of the water and spent 3 months repairing it. And I thought, if Chichester can do that, why can't I do that? But if I hadn't had him as a hero, I don't think I'd have thought of that. So I have a whole collection of men who inspire me when I'm in deep doo-doo, as it were. And I think if Ross Smith, for example, the man I was chasing to Australia, great Australian flyer, the best in my opinion in the early days, you look at their lives and you think, why can't I be like that? So I have a lot of heroes really, but they're almost all action heroes. None of them are sort of, pop star heroes or that sort of thing.
If you could turn back time, what advice would you tell your younger self?
Well, be more careful, really. But on the other hand, if I was more careful, I wouldn't have had all these adventures. I mean, I had been a television presenter in England, and it was a very good job with a very good pension and you know, high profile, and I could pick up extra money in all sorts of other places. And when I got the money to go and fly to Australia, now I had a row with my boss. It was an Australian called Bruce Gindra, and you know, I shouldn't have had that row with the boss. So my advice would have been that morning: just play it cool, and you know, and eat whatever rubbish he's going to go and feed you, and just pretend it's okay, rather than standing on my high horse and telling him to shove it and walking out. So be a bit more careful. But on the other hand, I have to admit that if I was more careful, a lot of the adventures wouldn't have happened.
What would you say was the highlight of your adventures?
Looking back on it, I think it may have. There were two. Both of them to do with the world flight. One of them is I had been in Russia for a month. I had two of us set off to fly around the world. I was down to one, and I had a Russian navigator. I had to get him to Nome, Alaska. And when we took off, we ran into ice, and so the whole of the aircraft was iced up. This is an open cockpit, like a hang glider with a motorbike underneath. And I remember Peter, my Russian navigator, scraping the ice off my visor with his fingernails, and we were stuck in cloud and couldn't see where we were or anything else like that. But we got through, and we landed in Nome, Alaska. And my feelings that night were just fantastic. I couldn't stay still. I was just so full of life. And a similar moment came when I was crossing the Atlantic. I had to fly from the east side of Greenland through to Iceland. And 3 hours, I'd already turned back once the previous day, 50 miles out to sea. And I'd gone the second time, and I was 200 miles out to sea when I ran into a warm front, which meant very strong winds. And at one time, my speed over the ground was 11 knots. You could run faster than my aircraft was going. And my GPS was saying time to Reykjavik 18.5 hours, and I knew I only had 8 hours fuel. And I had 3 hours of that, and it was a fantastic time.